message arrived in the dead of night. A single pulse of light on my communicator. No sender, no origin, just 3 words glowing on the screen. Don't trust them. I sat up fast, heart pounding. Outside my window, the rings of Galax-9 shimmered against the dark, beautiful and endless. Our colony station floated just beneath them, quiet, ordinary, safe. But whoever sent this message didn't think so. A second later, my communicator flickered again. The message was gone, wiped, as if it had never been there at all. And suddenly I heard a knock at my door. I didn't move, I barely breathed. Then a voice, calm, steady, and definitely not human. Open the door, Kian. We need to talk. Whoever they were, they knew my name. And that's when I realized this was Realms Unknown. Welcome to Realms Unknown, a podcast brought to you by the Bugle, the anal retentive alethiometer of truth and justice, in whose hallowed waveforms we will see written chat about science fiction, fantasy, books, movies, games, and more. Each week, I, Alice published author Fraser, will reach into the Gom Jabbar and withstand the pain in order to bring you about half an hour of chat about all the escapism you've ever desired. As for who will be strapping on their adventure hat and joining us on this week's quest, it is the Will to my Lyra, the Bastion to my Atreyu. No, get out of that swamp! The Sophie to my Hal, the Jar Jar Binks to my pod racing Anakin Skywalker. It is the brilliant Chris Skinner.
I was happy to be here. The moment you said alethiometer, I was like, oh, this is going to be fun.
It's going to be so much fun. This is our second episode of our Book Week special. So hop aboard like Meg Murray tessering into the unknown and prepare for a journey through Realms Unknown. Welcome. This is exciting. If you are listening for the first time, subscribe to us on the Bugle channel on all of your podcast hosts, or go to thebuglepodcast.com and figure out how to become a paid subscriber. All the books that we cover here will be in our show notes linked. So if you miss a book and it sounded good to you, then go to our show notes. What have you been reading, listening to, but mostly reading in this week's Book Week world?
Well, we're going to talk a lot about books, but actually I got distracted at the weekend by something that I think is really rare in this world, which is a quality piece of fantasy or sci-fi music.
Oh,
And
hello.
Look, don't get me wrong. Some people have done it well. Some electronic groups lean into sci-fi, do a really good job. I guess Led Zepp have dipped into fantasy with varying results.
Yep.
But here was an artist I wasn't expecting. And this is a 10-year-old album, 10 plus years. It's the ArchAndroid by Janelle Monáe. And I knew some of the songs off it, but I'd never listened to the album. And the whole album is it's just a beautiful, funky pop space odyssey. I think, and I might have misunderstood it. I get the sense that there is basically Android meets real human love, and can that be compatible type vibe going on, and she does it without it being like a blip 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 electronic album. There are obviously elements of that and the sort of big epic orchestral space sounds, but it's mostly a pop record. And so big shout out to Janelle Monáe for making a super credible, family friendly. We had it on at dinner yesterday. A family friendly sci-fi record.
I'm going to second you on sci-fi record and talk about Trinity by LayLow.
Okay.
Which is a sci-fi story. It's a really beautiful arc told in an album. And I love an album story because I feel like that we've lost that in the streaming service age, where you listen to an album from beginning to end. It starts with songs are sort of about this relationship that this central character is having with that the singer is having. It's one of those sort of too passionate, too intense, too like love story, but too much. They're kind of all in each other's face, and then how it sort of becomes overwhelming, and then it breaks down, and then he tries to get her back, and then at about, as this is a spoiler alert if you're going to listen to this album, at about the sort of 3/4 to 4/5 mark, it is revealed that she is a simulation. And that her job was to give you those feelings, that to have that experience of sort of passion, obsession, and love was the task of this simulation / AI. But he can't get her back, and he can't get those feelings back because they were artificially induced. But the feelings themselves were not artificial, and it's really fun and interesting and exciting. But it is essentially a sci-fi album, and I really enjoyed it. If you like that kind of music, it is worth listening to. That's by LayLow, and it's called Trinity. So we're going to be talking about books, particularly for kids from 12 to 17 or a precocious 10 to 17, because
Yes.
I'm thinking about myself as a young reader getting into stuff that I probably was not ready for. That's this week. But first, we're going to start with our Trope on a Rope segment, a trope that you've seen too much of or seen a lot of but still enjoy. Mine, particularly for this age group, is parental neglect.
Yes.
So many of the
Yeah.
fantasy and sci-fi stories are predicated on absent, sick, horrible parents, whatever it is. And I mean, this is maybe across all of fantasy. There is no, I remember watching, so on the first flight that I took after my mom died, I was going from Sydney to Perth. It's a 5-hour flight. And I thought, I can't watch action movies, which is my normal go-to on a flight. It's too much. It's too intense. I'll just watch Disney movies. And I flipped through about 5 Disney movies, the first 5 minutes of which all have parents dying so that the action can happen. I was an absolute mess. It was dreadful. But I think, obviously, in order for these children to do the wildly dangerous things that are required for the plot to continue and to be given the levels of responsibility and excitement, you need either a sort of a Narnia-style pocket universe in which time doesn't pass in the real world, or you need parental neglect. Now, Narnia does both.
It does.
But I mean, it's wartime parental neglect, so it doesn't count. But I would say that's my trope on a rope. I would like to see some loving and engaged parents involved. I think one that does it very well, and this is probably for the slightly older end of the spectrum, is The Golden Enclaves by Naomi Novik. It's a trilogy in which the heroine, it's a wizarding school, but the premise of the wizarding school is that monsters are drawn to the power of wizards and they eat their energy. And you, during your teenage years, you're immensely vulnerable to being eaten by monsters or mals. And so it's a lottery. You want really, 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 you want to get into this school, that the school is brutal and only about, some percentage of the children get through it, but their odds are better in the school than they are outside of the school. And so our central character has been told by prophecy that she is the Dark One, and she's going to lead to the destruction of all of the wizard enclaves and bring them down. And so you have to figure out, she thinks she's constantly, she was brought up by a really loving mother, a beautiful and infinitely giving mother who can't contact her because she's in this pocket universe going to this horrible school, but she's constantly fighting to be good in the way that her loving mother would want her to be, while fighting this consciousness that by stone written prophecy, she is going to end up the baddie, and everyone else knows that there's something off about her. She's got dark wizard energy. It's really fun. It's so well written. It is young adult fiction in the way that before young adult fiction got read by mostly adults and then turned into romantasy, I guess. But it's like proper, I would say 14 to 17, just beautifully written. I will read anything written by Naomi Novik. A lot of fun. The Golden Enclaves series. So, and just as a little kind of Easter egg, her name is Galadriel.
Very
of
nice.
the love me and despair Galadriel kind of.
I like the parental neglect thing. In the previous episode, we talked about Not Now Bernard, and I love an aged up version with Bernard and the monster maybe combining to take on the effects of that parental neglect.
Yeah, maybe. I think so. I think sort of comes in part by narrative necessity and in part from an age where parents were less helicoptery, where, the famous 5 would go off and do their thing, or, the magic faraway tree, you leave your 6-year-old to supervise the 3-year-old. And they get to have adventures on those long, hot summer afternoons and don't come in until you can see the streetlights on, kind of thing.
We're going on a bear hunt, but without the fantasy. Does exactly the same thing.
Yeah, but this is one of the interesting sort of side notes, is that children playing outside was stopped by a concerted effort by Gas and Oil to do ads that talked about the danger of cars on the road, because you had more people owning individual cars in the 70s and 80s, more accidents with children in the road because children used to play pretty freely in the roads. So you had the option of either trying to make the roads safer for children by regulating car speeds in suburban areas, for example, or getting all the children off the roads. And they did these ads about like get your children off the roads, and now you don't see children playing in the street anymore.
No,
Sad.
that is quite sad. Well, we need to write a revolutionary new set of books that gets kids lost again.
What's your trope on a rope for the week?
Okay, this is very relevant to all those children out there who are really struggling to deal with modern languages out there, whether they are being pressured by well-meaning parents, not including myself, of course, to do Duolingo, or they are there battling their way through French or Spanish or German every week. This is the trope that a being who may not just be foreign, but maybe from an entirely different species, somehow in about the length of one chapter or a scene, goes from just grunting at someone to completely knowing the language and speaking it fluently, including all the slang.
Yeah.
It is something that you just, I mean, look, I appreciate a lot of the beings in these stories are quite intelligent and smart, but the way they seem to pick up colloquialisms without even being exposed to them, and yet it does my head in. It does. Alice, I've been learning Spanish on Duolingo for 3 years. I go to night school. Yeah, I've been going to night school for months now, and I am still about 5 minutes of scripting of one of these shows into this. It's outrageous and unacceptable.
So your trope on a rope is learning things too quickly.
It's not fair.
It's not fair. It is. It gives you unrealistic expectations.
Absolutely.
And that brings us to our genre deep dive, our subgenre submarine, which in this area of, is this young adult? This is late teen.
Yeah, I mean,
teen fiction.
It does vary quite a lot. I think the content of some of these books, when I looked through them, I was like, that one definitely feels. Some of these definitely feel like books I would read now. Some definitely feel like books I'd be comfortable with my children reading, but I would maybe leave my own. So we're definitely in a kind of middle ground here. Some of what, and I think it might be interesting to discuss why some of those books are that. So like why are some of these good for adults? Why are some of these not so good for adults as well?
Yes. So my subgenre in this genre is sibling adventures.
Right.
Where you're going on an adventure with your brothers and your sisters, and the dynamics between you and the ways in which the different ones of you get in trouble, I think is just a really strong through line in science fiction, particularly in fantasy. You've got the magical faraway tree, you've got The Dark is Rising, big recommendation by Susan Cooper, The Dark is Rising. You've got the Narnia series, obviously, the massive archetype of the Narnia series. You've got some of the Gillian Rubinstein books, which are science fiction. One of them is set in a video game and returns back there.
The Stormkeeper books, which I mentioned in the last episode, have got a classic rival siblings falling out, but will they come together to save the day type vibe about it as well.
Yeah, I like that very much. And of course, in film you have Frozen being a very obvious example of that. So sibling adventure is my subgenre recommendation for this week. Why do you think your teenager should be reading fantasy? Because we mentioned before that like 0 to 5, all the books, unless they're like quiet gardening books, are a fantasy. Why do you think teenagers should be reading science fiction and fantasy?
Okay, I think again it is a manageable way to explore quite deep, complicated, and sometimes quite painful themes. I think particularly for different generations of children have grown up, and much great fantasy writing happens, say, during or between major wars. And I think it by delivering stories that help understand what is going on through fantasy, I think is really important. I think understanding the pros and cons of being a rebel, of what it's like to push against the mainstream, are done really, really well in fantasy and in sci-fi. And fantasy is a super way to explore identity. So if you're even if you're whether you're finding your sexuality, whether you are straight or you are not, fantasy does a great way of saying, well, can there be love between an elf and a human? Can an orc and a dwarf ever be friends? Can this robot truly get on with the human?
Well, sort of by its nature of having these kind of interspecies or interclass or into whatever relationships, they help you process coming into sexuality and the sort of the forbiddenness and the appeal and the fact that it's something that is an adult thing, but you're starting to have these feelings and you're not sure how to process them or how much you're allowed to indulge them. Are you allowed to go on dates? Are you allowed to hold hands?
Yeah.
What is like all of that stuff is kind of played out through these metaphors of what is forbidden and what is allowed,
Yeah.
which I think is really great fun. What are your recommendations?
Okay. I'm going to start. So I think we agreed before the show that we weren't going to spend much time on the obvious classics. So I think we can all say um, the Potterbit books, the Tolkien books, the C.S. Lewis books. I think take as read. I mean, I think there are varying opinions on them, but they're pretty good. You're probably going to end up reading them. A show like this does not need to be recommending those.
Yes.
But there is a really big series I do think we should spend time on,
Excellent.
which is Philip Pullman's. Like, so his Dark Materials, and then so far there are 2, but there will be 3 books of Dust as well.
I also have another Philip Pullman recommendation, which is a side recommendation, it's a different one. But yes, tell me about them. They're written basically as an answer to the Narnia series, and I loved that. I read them when I was a young adult. Obviously, they didn't come out in my childhood, but I remember reading the Narnia books when I was about 10, and feeling really betrayed at the end as someone who wasn't brought up in a Judeo-Christian tradition. I was brought up as a Buddhist. So when it was like, spoiler alert, sorry, Aslan is Jesus all along, I was like, oh, I felt like I'd been tricked.
Yeah.
And I think that must have been magical if you were a Christian child reading these books and then finding out that the superhero was the superhero along, that Clark Kent was Superman. That must have been delightful for you. But I felt like a bit of a letdown. And so to read the Philip Pullman books, which is a counter argument against religious narratives, it was a delight to me.
And it's done so well. Just as a little side note, I got into my very strict Catholic school simply because I was able to talk so enthusiastically about C.S. Lewis's work. I think they were like, what have I got really to hang on here? And it was that, and they absolutely loved me, and soon clocked that I maybe wasn't the ideal student. But so Pullman does so many really interesting things, and there is definitely an element of science fiction. There are tools and gadgets and devices that feel more scientific than fantastical in them. The fact that you're traveling through parallel universe again is something that happens both in fantasy and in science fiction. But the way it takes on philosophy, and for me, again, reading it as an adult, but having not read much fiction that went this way, basically this rebellion against the establishment, and whether or not it was a religious establishment or a political establishment, or for that matter, I guess your boss. It's like it was just so refreshing to hear it done in the way that, like, there is no overcoming this. There's no overcoming this. There's no overcoming this. Or actually, maybe there is a way. And that is loads of small uniting forces coming together. So it's a really inspirational book.
Your central character, Lyra, great. Manipulative, sneaky, naughty, but benevolent at heart. She reminded me of my grandmother, who survived the Holocaust by never doing what anyone told her to do, ever. And obviously later in life, in peacetime in Australia, that was not the best characteristic. But she was like that. She just kind of... I found that so fun. And then Will, of course, such a beautiful, strong, noble character from such a difficult background as a carer for his mother, who's suffering with mental health stuff. Obviously, I felt very strongly about that. It's just such strongly drawn characters and not milky, sort of milky leads, which arguably some other children's books are presenting these sort of golden haloed children who never do anything very naughty. Great, complicated child characters. And on that note, I want to recommend another Philip Pullman book that I don't think gets as much press as the Golden Compass series, which is the Sally Lockhart Mysteries, which start with the ruby in the smoke, go to the shadow in the north, the tiger in the well, and the tin princess. It's a female detective character who has a child, a toddler that she has to look after, and it's so great. It's so fun. It's like Sherlock Holmes modernized to a modern sensibility. It does an incredible job of drawing London at a particular period where you had the pogroms in Russia driving out the Jewish community into London, who were then forming sort of mafia cartels and figuring out where they fit into society. And it deals with alienation and loneliness and being a woman on your own. And it's just just a banger. That's the Ruby and the Smoke, the Sally Lockhart mysteries. There's 4 books in that series. If you liked the Golden Compass, I highly recommend them.
I've only done the Ruby and the Smoke of those, and I loved it. And you've just reminded me, like, why have I not read any more of them? You also, you talk about the pogroms. I think one of the things that Pullman's books do is that the world is so similar to this one, in the way that it's many of the countries and the dominant cities and the places, they are like, you can almost imagine in Samarkand in a parallel universe could have become one of the most important cities in the world.
Yeah.
And there could have been a country dominated by the Cossacks, and all of these things could have believably happened.
Yeah, so much of Philip Pullman's fantasy sort of feels a lot like alternate universe
Yeah,
history,
yeah,
and
yeah.
it's so clearly grounded in research of real history and an understanding of human nature, combining to make what to me is the best kind of fantasy, which is fantasy that feels like you could just step sideways. You could just take a knife and cut a little portal and step
Yeah.
sideways into that world.
Can I just do a quick mention for the Book of Dust books? I don't know if you've done these as well.
Mm-hmm.
I found the Book of Dust so refreshing because I was, like all great sort of trilogies and series of books, I was genuinely quite gutted when I got to the end of his Dark Materials, and I was so excited when I heard there was going to be one and then a second book. So the first one sort of starts as a prequel,
Mm-hmm.
and it genuinely serves as a prequel. The second of the books is a sequel,
Mm-hmm.
and in that, so you have Lyra grown up as an adult, as the sort of not quite settled in her path university student that you would have expected the child Lyra to become in the first set of books. And they're great books. They are aged up slightly, and I think that's what works quite nicely, because it would take you a bit of a while to maybe get through those. So if you start reading those first books when you're 12ish, you're definitely, by the time you're 15, ready for the Book of Dust books. And I think the way Philip Pullman assumes that people have done those first books and isn't aging them at the same level the first one is really, really great.
Excellent. What other recommendations that I have? Shout out to my Australian author Garth Nick's Sabriel series, which was written in 1995. It's a young adult, but the Sabriel essentially is a necromancer.
Right.
And the writing is beautiful, the characterization is beautiful, and it's really interesting as a character that is not rebelling against authority, but actually trying to hold it together, trying to take responsibility for. I don't want to spoil anything, but take responsibility for a system that needs to be maintained, which is the process of death and passing into the underlife. And she has to kind of step up into this responsibility. She's not rebelling. She's doing her now suddenly job
Right,
as
right.
a teenager.
Yeah.
And it just as a counterbalance to the ones where it's like screw everyone, screw everything, sort of figuring out how to make life work with these responsibilities. It's got magic, it's got this like series of bells, it's got a cat that is also a demon encompassed in a cat. It's
Right.
just it's so interesting. The world building is amazing. The magic system is amazing. Garth Nick's Sabriel series is really genuinely brilliant. And then also on the more fantasy end of the spectrum, I just loved the Tortle Adventures, the Lioness series by Tamora Pierce.
Oh, I don't know these at all.
For girls particularly, I will buy them all for your daughters. It's incredible. That it's a story of twins, a girl and a boy. The boy does not like knightly arts, doesn't like fighting, doesn't like that kind of thing. He wants to go to magic school, and so they agree at the beginning that she will disguise herself as a boy and become a knight, and he will go off to magic school. And they trick their loving father into he's loving but absent-minded,
Yeah.
and so she goes off, and they perpetrate this fraud on the system, and get through the entirety of essentially high school in this lie. And of course, then he, becoming a wizard, gets all these like moral ambiguities going on, and she becomes a knight. It's so much fun. It's really interesting characters. It's just straight down the line fantasy adventure. Girl being, she's smaller than the others. It's not unrealistic about her fighting capacities, just about how hard she has to work in order to get there. The people who are on her side, the people who know her secret and who don't. It deals with like romance very well. You know, she falls for this one and then she falls for the other. It actually has a falling in love and then a breakup, which you don't often see in this
Right,
kind of
yeah,
fantasy thing
yeah.
where they get together and it's good, but they're incompatible for various reasons, which I won't
Mm.
spoil. But then they break up and she finds someone who's more suited to her, and then that's a really difficult relationship. And then she has, you know, an on the road fling with someone, and then obviously none of this is graphic, but you're dealing with these kind of emotional realities that are actually probably more realistic to a teenage experience of like you're in love with this
Well, you
person.
don't find the one
Yeah,
in the playground when you're 14
yeah,
years old, but you do, like, tell your mates that you quite like that one over there.
yeah, exactly. So exploring that kind of thing is
Mm.
really fun. The magic system is great. Again, the fantasy is great. That's the Lioness series by Tamora Pierce, and it's set in a fantasy world called Tortle. Um, Lots of fun there.
Can I change gear a little bit?
Yes.
We haven't talked about Terry Pratchett.
Ah,
A
yes.
and so these books
Are they for young people?
well,
Are they
this
for old people? Are they for everyone?
yeah, this but because kids can read them, I think, definitely gets them into the category. So I, borrowed mine from my granddad, and
Yeah.
so we I would go and stay at my grandparents quite a lot, and he had all of the books on his shelf, and I remember picking them up and just I think it was I don't think I'd ever had and have since laughed so hard out loud at books that are like genuinely not just comedy books, like books that genuinely have proper character and story and emotion, and they are often really fast paced. And
Hmm.
again, you know, as a teenager, I was on off. Sometimes I could read a 300, 400 page book
Hmm.
without it being an issue. But blimey, I loved a 150 pager that I could just work through at different points as well. Particularly when you're studying quite a lot and you've actually don't necessarily have a lot of time to do that. A couple of books I really recommend if you don't know where to start with Terry Pratchett. So Mort and Eric are two of those. Like all great fantasy, they're not earnest. They're smart, but they're funny. So Mort is so Death is a recurring significant character in the Discworld series. And I think this is the first one that Death is in a serious way anyway. So Death is having an existential crisis in it, which is
Yes.
for a start is really
So
funny.
much fun.
Mort is kind of useless, and I like the way that Mort is. I mean, definitely when I was a teenager holding down bad jobs, Mort feels like a proxy for any awkward teenager trying to do a part-time job or an apprenticeship and trying to make it work. And so Mort has to kind of fill some of the gaps. Everything goes wrong. The universe is trying to fix itself, which lends itself to comedy so well, whilst being set in this just massive world. I mean, it's genuine satire as well if you care to follow those threads.
Yes, I love a character who is like Death, immensely profound and wise
Mm,
in one way, and then the other way, absolutely naive and completely idiotic about
yes.
something. Just has massive knowledge gaps because that isn't quite a good one to one for the experience of being a teenager. In some ways, you are as wise as you will ever be. Your
Mm,
brain is as big as it will ever be. You're as intelligent as you'll ever be. You have the capacity and depth of feeling this may be greater than it will ever be, and yet you've got these massive blank spots
yeah.
in your capacity to understand the world in your experience. And I think that is just such a fun dynamic to play with. Yeah, I highly recommend that.
Oh, just one other thing about the Pratchett books that I think he does really well, and this so Mort gets the job
Yeah,
at a job fair, which was a very I don't know when the book was written, maybe 80s.
yeah, yeah,
That was a very 80s, 90s thing, the idea of job fairs. There were not medieval job fairs, which is obviously where the book is set. And that, I guess that leans into the satire side of it. The idea, the relatability of what Terry Pratchett could do is he'd take something very modern and just, without apology, just dump it into the medieval setting.
yeah. I mean, Pratchett is so good on satire. His description of Sam Vimes's economic theory of Boots' unfairness
Yeah.
is it just holds good to this day as one of the best summations of the ways in which rich people get richer and poor people get poorer. It still stands good. We've done a lot of fantasy. I want to drop one or two sci-fi
Go.
recommendations in before we move to our next ad section and wind up the show. Gillian Rubinstein's Galax-Arena. Now, this Gillian Rubinstein in general. She does the Space Demons trilogy, which is set in a video game. But Galax-Arena, I want to recommend as a really sort of disturbing, interesting, unusual book for teenagers. There's 3 children. They are forced onto a spaceship and taken to a planet and in an institution where they're forced to be gymnasts. They
Of course.
for their alien captors, and you find out sort of that there's a sinister undercurrent, and how do you escape? And then there's a big twist to the end of it, which I will not spoil, but it's like one of the first like hair-raising twists that I ever read,
Okay.
where it actually like it all incredible story, I think. So that is Galax-Arena. It was written in 1997, or it came out in 1997, and I probably read it about then, and it just had a really big impact in my idea of how stories run and ought to run. And it's got sort of, again, I think there's a lot of post-apocalyptic teen fiction, partly because you, as a teenager, you want a world in which you are given responsibilities, and you can't imagine the world with the systems that we have now letting you run a thing or
Mm.
be in charge of a thing or be the best at something without the supervision of your parents. And so I think finding out the ways that these books do that, whether it's being kidnapped by aliens or not, I think is always fascinating.
It's right back to the escapism that we spoke about on yesterday's episode, taking you out of those real environments.
And that brings us to your ads section, because you can't be what you can't buy. Soar through the skies with the Starfall hoverboard, powered by anti-gravity tech and stabilized by quantum gyros. Pester your parents so that you can glide over traffic, dodge space pirates, and impress the brooding rebel of the local trash fighting group. The Starfall hoverboard, the coolest thing at your school or other school equivalent. And this episode of the podcast is brought to you by the Lunar Blaster, for when diplomacy fails. Do you need to defend yourself against space pirates, rogue cyborgs, or your annoying little sibling? The Lunar Blaster has 3 settings. Zap, mildly inconvenient. Freeze, your enemies won't be mad if they're literally made of ice and can be shattered with a touch of your finger. Or, oops, you weren't supposed to press that button. Illegal on 72 planets. Use responsibly. The Lunar Blaster.
A great way to get into sci-fi and fantasy and truly understand which elements of it you like, and we haven't talked about this yet, is collections of short stories. So I found my way in through collections more broadly in speculative, or only in fantasy, or only in science fiction. For me, it was absolutely like the way that I discovered which subgenres I was into, which ones I was not. It would give me a list of maybe 10, 15 authors who I would then go to the library or now go online and find out who they were. And you know, just getting like a fully composed story in 10 pages, or 20 or 30, as they sometimes can extend to, is really exciting and really interesting in its own right. I've got one recommendation, which is on the older end, which is Dangerous Women, compiled by George R.R. Martin and Gardner Dozois. George R.R. Martin, I think the selling point is that there is a little bit of Westeros that makes it into this, but it gives coverage to a Robin Hobb, to Joe Abercrombie, to other people who go, you know, in the early stage of their career have gone on to have other success. In this example specifically, the Joe Abercrombie book is basically a Western with a tiny sci-fi fantasy twist. They're on another planet. Magic is present. You get through it in about 10, 20 pages. And then it turns out that there's a whole series of novels based on that main character.
Amazing.
And so just a shout out to the collections of short stories.
Collections of short stories. I will second that. If you are writing a children's book or a teen book, by the way, I run writers' meetings on my Patreon twice a week. So, and we're about to start making it 3 times a week. If you're working on a novel length thing, there'll be an extra thing, because at the moment we are privileging short stories so we can share them in the workshop. Short stories, poems. People are working on musicals. People are working on academic treatises. It's over at patreon.com/Alice Fraser. If you want to come write with me, I'm now a published author. If you want to read A Passion for Passion, that's my book. It is published in unison with the Bugle. We did it together. This is our product, A Passion for Passion, and you can buy that on Amazon or bookshop.org, or if you go to thebuglepodcast.com, that's where you can also find the show notes for this episode. Do we have any final thoughts before we go away? Basically, get your children reading. And if they don't like reading, it's because they're not reading the right thing yet.
Yeah.
This is the thing. You've got to find what is going to capture their imagination, whether it is anime, and I know we haven't touched a lot on
Oh
anime,
my
but there's
gosh,
some
not even started.
incredible. Maybe we need to do
Yeah.
another episode on anime. There's
Yeah.
an incredible anime, particularly for teenagers, and there's some dark but beautifully written graphic novels in the Western tradition as well. Whether that's they're in, or whether it's short stories, or whether it's reading out loud to them, or whether it's getting them in via the movies or the games that are based on some of these classics, is just an incredible way to explore the world, to explore yourself in a safe place by projecting into these different characters and playing out the ways in which they go. I was a reader as an escape as a teenager. I was looking after my mum. I was pretty miserable. I was bullied at school. I spent all of my time in books. I used to run away to the library. I'd skip class and go to the library, or I'd go to the library during lunchtime, until I had to stop because the library monitors felt so sorry for me that they gave me an honorary library monitor badge.
That's cool.
And
That's pretty cool.
I was so embarrassed.
Really, really cool.
But as a way of rebelling, as a way of escaping, as a way of self-medicating, I think it's probably one of the healthiest ones out there. And I think all teens probably need some self-medication, and it's better a book than an online forum, is all I'm saying.
No, I agree with that. I can't believe we've done these 2 episodes without actually talking about, you mentioned anime. Obviously, a lot of Studio Ghibli is based on novels.
Yep.
And we haven't once in a week where Wicked has had Oscar success, that we haven't even touched on the 125-year-old Wonderful Wizard of Oz novel, which in so many ways kicked off a lot of modern fantasy storytelling.
I know. There are so many books that I would love to recommend. As I said, I spent my entire teenagehood and young adulthood, and from the age of about 7, I was in a book most of the time. Books like Ender's Game by Orson Scott Card, I would recommend at the top of my pile, except I would say don't read any of the sequels. And Dune, I would say also is a teen book that you can read as a teenager. It's about environmentalism. Again, I would read Dune, but maybe not the other ones until you're a little older, because the other ones get increasingly weird. There are just so many great books, and we have obviously missed more than 99% of all of the ones that were deeply impactful to us. So please check out the show notes, and also send us in your recommendations for children's books, young adult books, over at thebuglepodcast.com. So that's Realms Unknown at thebuglepodcast.com. This is a Bugle Podcast and Alice Fraser production. Your editor is Ped Hunter. Your executive producer is Chris Skinner. I'll talk to you again next week. Happy Book Week!